everyone, this is Will, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Now, if you quickly take a look at around the world today, the countries in Asia are on the rise. Now, to be more specific, China, one of the largest economies in the world, today it's holding this ongoing political but also this economic battle with another country which is also considered one of the largest economies in the world, which is the United States of America. But meanwhile, at this moment, it's rather careful that we'll say that no country, especially in Asia, would like to be caught in the middle. But however, India, unfortunately, is dancing or in a limbo position between the two countries. So that's why today that we are going to talk about the India's current political and social changes under this ongoing political shift in China and also under Washington. Now, join our show today is Mr. Sushant Singh. Now, Sushant is a senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research in India, and he was previously a lecturer in the political science at Yale University and the deputy editor of the Indian Express, reporting on strategic affairs, international security, and international affairs. Sushant, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for having me on the show.
No problem, Sushant. The pleasure's all mine. Now, as I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this insightful and amazing article that you wrote and entitled, India's China Policy is Confused. As I mentioned in the intro, that we know that today, when we look at this ongoing political or social or economic battle between the United States and China, no country would like to be caught in the middle. But now, going back to the article, and again, this is something that you wrote, you said on one side, India seeks to benefit from initiatives that contain China, but it is fearful of antagonizing the superpower and thus willing to work with it in certain areas. So my first question to you is, how would you describe today's relationship between India and China, especially politically and economically?
So let me start with the economic part first. As you know, Will, the economic ties between India and China over the last 30 years, since Indian economy opened in the early 1990s and the Chinese globalization took place post the WTO regime and as the Chinese economy developed. China is India's number one trading partner. They do more trade than India and the US do, which is a close second. The bilateral trade between them is somewhere in the range of around $125 billion every year, which is 70% of which is the imports that India does from China, and the balance is the export. So the trade balance is, dramatically in China's favor when it comes to the bilateral trade. So even during the current border crisis in the last couple of years, there's been no reduction in the bilateral trade. In fact, the trade has only gone up during this period. Then you have other multilateral bodies like the AIIB, the Beijing-based bank, infrastructure and investment bank, which is headed by China, where China is the biggest shareholder. You'll be surprised to know, Will, that almost a quarter of its investment, its loans, are in India, and these loans have again happened during this period when the crisis was on. More than 25,000 Indian students actually study in China. They've been wanting to go back. That is the second largest number of students, or the third largest, depending on how you count it, after Korea and Indonesia, which study in China. Most of them are medical students. So the economic ties between India and China remain very strong. Although India in the last couple of years has taken some very small, minor cosmetic steps in that sense, like putting Chinese investment in India under special approvals. So if you are getting some money from China, that would need additional approvals to be invested in India. Some of the Chinese telecom companies have been put under pressure. They're being targeted by tax authorities and so on and so forth. And Huawei and others have not been allowed in 5G mobile networks in India. Certain apps of Chinese companies are also banned. But overall, in terms of the larger economic picture, if you look between India and China, that remains very strong and very robust in a manner. As far as the political ties are concerned, political ties between India and China had improved after the Doklam crisis of 2017. It was a 73-day standoff on Bhutanese territory between India and China. After that, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, they met in Wuhan for a long informal summit and again in Chennai in 2019. But the relationship almost nosedived in 2020 when the COVID had just started. There was a major border crisis in Ladakh, in the Himalayas, between India and China. In fact, on June 15, 2020, more than nearly 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 PLA soldiers were killed in hand-to-hand clashes. And since then, almost 100,000 soldiers from India and China have been deployed on that border additionally, who were not deployed earlier. There's been additional infrastructure which has been constructed in those areas. And the situation remains tense despite 15 rounds of talks between the militaries and 10 rounds of talks between diplomats. The official Indian line has been that there can be no normalcy in bilateral ties if the border crisis is still on. But what we are witnessing more and more is that India is willing to, even as the crisis remains, India is willing to engage with China, if not bilaterally, then at least through multilateral institutions like the BRICS, in which both India and China are an important component, and even in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, we have just had the meeting of the National Security Advisors of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it in fact dealt with border guarding forces, which was hosted by India. Similarly, the Indian National Security Advisor has attended the meetings. Indian Foreign Minister was in the BRICS meeting, which was addressed by President Xi Jinping virtually from Beijing. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi would be attending the BRICS summit, which is taking place on 24th of June, which will again be chaired by and addressed by President Xi Jinping. So it's a very complex kind of a situation. While India and China seem to be, fighting on the border, standing against each other on the border, all the rhetoric is there. But slowly but surely, a certain amount of engagement has already started between the two countries.
Sushant, I want to get a little bit deeper since we are still on this economic topic. As much as I know that this year, 2022, is one of the crucial years for China, especially celebrates the 10-year anniversary for Belt and Road Initiative. Now, considerably speaking, this is one of the major projects under current leader Xi Jinping and involve more than 100 countries, again, across the world. But meanwhile, that, as you mentioned before, both India and China play significant roles within this BRICS community. And meanwhile, India also played another significant matter in what we called the Quad relationship, which, involved the U.S. Going back to the conversation that we had before, no country prefers being caught in the middle, especially between U.S. and America at this moment. But India, unfortunately, is facing or looking at the two major political or economic giants. Now, my next question to you, Sushant, is how do you think that Narendra Modi is balancing the relationship with both countries without actually leaning towards one or either of the partners for the bigger picture? So in other words, how should Narendra Modi position himself in order to continue this positive and meaningful relationship with Joe Biden and Xi Jinping?
Yeah, so, let me step back a bit. So, as you know, India's historically, India has always had a non-aligned policy and has always valued strategic sovereignty. It has never had a military alliance with any country whatsoever, whether it be the erstwhile Soviet Union or the United States or even after the Cold War. It has always valued an independent foreign policy. This is the legacy that Mr. Modi inherited from the time of Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1940s, since India's independence from British colonial rule. That forms the founding principle or the bedrock of India's thinking and India's policies. And that is something which Mr. Modi is trying to protect when he's trying to deal with these two countries on which are now contesting against each other, which are almost at each other's throats. Now, the challenge for India is that even within the Quad, India actually stands out India is not a treaty ally of the United States like Japan and Australia are. Neither Japan nor Australia nor the United States share a disputed land border with China. India shares a disputed land border with China. So the India is, as you saw from the recent Quad summit, India was not really agreeing on most of the points, whether it was about vaccine, whether it was about digital rights, whether it was human rights, whether it was, even in the IPEF, it was not in agreement with the ideas that others had, or including for the Russian military operation in Ukraine. India is at odds with other members of the Quad. So India, in a sense, while it's a member of the Quad, in some sense trying to counter China or externally rebalance China, it stands out of the Quad in a certain way. And it is in this gap that in the Quad where India stands out, that India tries to engage with China at the same time, as you rightly said, through BRICS, through SCO, and through other mechanisms. If the border crisis in 2020 had not taken place in Ladakh, India probably would not have gone and had a Quad summit. As you know, India was very hesitant to have a Quad summit. It refused to make Quad a military alliance, a security alliance. So Quad does everything, which is, like from vaccine, there's that trade, etc., fishing, but it does not do a military alliance, which has been given to the AUKUS. So what Mr. Modi is trying to do as an inheritor of a very proud Indian legacy is trying to balance in a manner that he does not provoke China, continues to keep some form of engagement with China so that it does not provoke China into taking an aggressive step, whether on the border or on trade or anything else, while still trying to build a relationship with the United States that allows him to provide an external rebalancing to China. So try and think it this way. There are two forms in which India can take on China. One is by internal rebalancing, that is by deploying a lot of its military and strategic resources on China internally. And the second is an external rebalancing, which you can do by having external partnerships, external alliances. Now, the challenge with external partnerships is that you may end up provoking China, and considering the gap in power between India and China, Chinese economy is 5 times India's size, Chinese defense budget is 4 times India's size, China is in a different league now. It is no longer the 1989 or 1996 China. So at this point in time, what India tries to do is actually do that amount of limited external rebalancing so that it does not provoke China and it continues to engage with China to somehow resolve the situation on the border and bring normalcy to the ties. That is the broad picture, broad framework of the strategy that we have seen in play over the last year or 18 months from Mr. Narendra Modi.
Now, Sushant, I want to continue with our conversation. Again, going back to the article, that's something you wrote. Meanwhile, India insists that its bilateral ties with China won't return to normalcy until the two countries resolve their issues on the border. And also, you said Beijing says the crisis should not hold their relationship hostage. New Delhi's position is disputed by the reality. But meanwhile, your article, it says India's China policy is confused. Now, based on what we said so far, to me that Narendra Modi has a very clear strategy, a very clear path in terms of dealing with China. But going back to the title of the article, why would you want to say, or why did you say that the current China policy is confused? In what way that the current policy is confusing, or if I dare to use the word ambiguous, to the world, but given the fact that we are still monitoring how China is continuing influencing the world politically and also economically, and when the US is trying to figure out its own strategy? Can you help us to understand?
So as we just discussed, Will, in the Quad, India stands out. There's nothing in the Quad that is common between India and other Quad members except for China. The fact that India goes to Quad and wants to be an important player in the Quad is essentially because of China. The attractiveness, when you talk to US officials, as I'm sure you would have spoken to, the attractiveness of India is essentially vis-a-vis China. The US National Security Advisor, as well as the Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell, were on a think tank last week, just 2 days back, where they clearly said that is on the big strategic goal, that is China, we need India. So what India is selling to the United States is that we are going to take on China. Even domestically within India, the Indian foreign minister, who's known to be very abrasive, takes these very strong positions and gives this rhetoric about, we're not going to take anything from China, we want to give this. But what happens is, despite what is being told to the US, despite the way US looks at it and other core members look at it, but when it comes to the reality, India is doing everything with China. As I said, there's a satellite agreement with BRICS. BRICS summit is going on. SCO meetings are going on. Everything is going on, and India is unable to resolve the border crisis at the same time. So it is selling the fact that it is a major power in Asia to stand up to China, and that is why US should give it technology, US should give us all the trade benefits, etc., etc. The world should love India and support India because it stands as a bulwark, as a counter to China. But when it comes to the reality of standing up to China, that's not true. India is willing to go with China. So when I meet certain US officials, and these are off the record meetings, they say that they are actually wondering what India's China policy is. Because, they worry that India may actually, if China takes a major step, let's say there's a summit between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi and the border crisis is resolved, would India go and actually hug China, and we work completely closely with China? And that what would be the rationale of the Quad or of the very close, strong Indo-US ties? And in that sense, the whole thing is confused when you look from three different places, from Beijing, from Delhi, and from Washington, D.C. India is promising different things to different people while doing something else altogether. And it's all very nice till the time it works. But as you know, with a tightrope walk, the moment the rope loosens a bit or something goes wrong, then the fall is very bad. And I think that's the warning I was trying to give in that piece in foreign policy.
But I want to go back to what you mentioned before, Sushant. It's regarding this ongoing war in Ukraine. More than almost 2 months that we are still watching how Vladimir Putin is continuing making his noises in the country of Ukraine, not only to the Ukrainian government, but also to the people. But I think that something that you might agree with me, that if we learn anything from the war in Ukraine, the U.S. today, this might be disputable, but cannot be a reliable partner when it comes to international crisis. And given the fact that in the U.S., domestically speaking, the policies are causing even wider firestorms, again, as we follow the media. So my question is, if we look at the example of war in Ukraine, the U.S. government is no longer trustworthy and reliable as the major source, what would hurt India the most just to, I don't want to use the word abandon, but to distance itself away from the US, but meanwhile grow closer with China? Again, look at this, the age we're looking at right now, that politically and socially, economically speaking, Xi Jinping is going to have another major milestone this year, continue his presidency. Meanwhile, the Belt and Road is growing, and also a country in Southeast Asia, they're growing much closer to China. So in other words, all the odds are against the US at this moment. So why not just to distance itself away from Joe Biden, bring much closer to Xi Jinping? What would happen if the Prime Minister Narendra Modi decides to do so? What would benefit, or what would be the damages for the India?
So essentially, there are two reasons why India is not willing to do that as of now. Number one, India has, as I mentioned earlier, India has a long legacy of a certain value system, certain idea of its position in the world. It actually does not even want a unipolar world where the US rules the world. It would want a multipolar world, and it would want to keep its own strategic independence, where it is not aligned to anyone and can work with anyone. But the second reason, which is more important and more direct to the question that you raised, is the fact that India has historically always, at least for the last 30 to 40 years, believed that China wants to establish its strategic hegemony in the region, and wants India to be a subservient power, subservient to China, paying its respect in a certain sense to the bigger power. They because of various reasons in operating out of history, culture, population, etc., India sees itself, like China, as a civilizational power and is unwilling to go down that path where it has to accept China is a superior power. Of course, everybody in India accepts that China is a bigger economy, China is a better military, etc., etc. But that willingness does not translate into publicly acknowledging a subservient position in the geopolitical order in Asia, where they say that okay, we are willing to be number two, or we are willing to be under them. And this is complicated by the fact that there are border disputes with the both countries do not agree on the borders, and there is a whole legacy of a war in 1962, after which the ties between the two countries completely dipped. As you know, not many Chinese tourists come to India. Not many Indian tourists go to China. China, I believe India is somewhere on the 60th on the list of the of number of tourists who come from China. So the ties are very limited. So if you are sitting in India, if let's say I'm sitting in India, I look at China intermediated by the Western prism. There are no journalists, virtually other than two journalists, operating out of China from India. So you can imagine all the media coverage, all the reportage, everything that I'm reading. As an English-speaking guy, I'm only reading through the Western media. So everything is being intermediated through the Western prism. Similarly, there are hardly any Chinese journalists in India who are reporting about India from a Chinese point of view. So we are in a situation where India, geopolitically, culturally, civilizationally, believes that it does not want to be subservient to China, and that is why this very tricky balancing game which you spoke of is being played. As far as your point about reliability of the United States, so at no point does India believe that the United States is going to come and deploy its soldiers against in India to take on China. Not that India would want that to happen, but in some other ways, even during the current crisis, U.S. officials have gone on record and said that they have provided intelligence to India, they have provided extreme cold climate clothing to soldiers, they have provided unarmed drones, they have provided satellite imagery, so on and so forth. So there are areas I understand these are areas of limited cooperation, as in the case of Ukraine, where the United States is giving limited equipment. But you would agree with me that India is in a much better shape than Ukraine as a military power and as a political and economic power, considering the fact that India is also a nuclear weapon state like China, Russia, Pakistan, or the United States. So these are the two reasons. One is the historical legacy and the self-image that India has about itself, of its position in the world, and second is its refusal to accept Chinese superiority or Chinese hegemony and a subservient position to Beijing in Asia. Those are the two reasons.
Sushant, now my next question, let's go back to the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that, if we pay attention to the rhetoric of the leaders today, that Joe Biden, the sitting U.S. president, runs on this principle that China, number one, it's one of the largest economies in the world, but meanwhile, by using such anti-China rhetoric, it's actually gaining more momentum within this democratic system. So in other words, if we thought Donald Trump, the words was harsh, but I think that if we pay attention to Joe Biden's policy or Joe Biden's rhetoric, that it's even worse. Now, how about for Prime Minister Narendra Modi? What kind of rhetoric that from this current Prime Minister it's running on in order to gain more momentum with the US and also with China? So in other words, do we really have to use hateful political languages in order to become popular, not only domestically speaking, but also internationally?
So in case of Mr. Modi, and now I'm not talking about him as representing India, I'm talking about Mr. Modi as an individual. Before Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister, he was the provincial leader of Gujarat, where he was the Chief Minister for some 12 years. As the Chief Minister of a province of Gujarat, he was not allowed to travel to Western countries because there was a major anti-Muslim riot in Gujarat in 2002, and his visa was taken away by the United States and the United Kingdom and other Western countries. He was regularly visiting China during that period and held China in very high esteem. He always said that, no, I would want to make my province like China. So personally speaking, he has had great relationship with China. So going back to his period, even before he became the Prime Minister of India. Secondly, even after he became Prime Minister of India, I think the first major leader he met within months was the then Chinese premier who came to meet him in August 2014, immediately after becoming prime minister. In 2015, he visited Beijing. Before the pandemic struck, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi had met 18 times. In a period of 5 years, they had met 18 times. Mr. Modi has never used strong rhetoric against China. Even after 20 Indian soldiers died in Galwan in June 2020, Mr. Modi has not said anything which is aggressive or assertive against China. He has taken a policy of not mentioning China in any of his public speeches at all. What we see from Mr. Modi is that China is never uttered as a word by him. Because this border crisis is on, he does not want to go out and say, for whatever reasons, whether it is because he does not want to be seen weak, because of what the crisis is still on, or because he believes in this very macho image of himself, or it could be because he loves China, or for whatever reason. But he has, unlike Joe Biden, Mr. Modi, going back to because of his old relationship with China and because of his very strong macho image, he's unwilling to go down that path and say a word about China. In fact, a lot of political criticism in India from the opposition parties and from a lot of other people comes that Mr. Modi is ignoring China's provocations and is scared, is unwilling to take China's name despite what is going on the border.
Sushant, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's go back to your article. Towards the end of the portion of your article, something that you wrote also stood out, and I quote, Modi desires maneuverability for India, calculating that it can't afford to antagonize a superpower, but needs to work with other global powers to secure its interest. This is something very interesting. That's, if I interpret what you wrote right, needs to work with other global powers. Can you help us to understand, does that mean that India is asking or India is inviting other global powers such a country as Australia, New Zealand, countries in the Europeans are working with India closely in order to secure the safety or the interest for India, but meanwhile balancing this global relationship with China, with the US? Can you help us to understand what are you trying to say within this paragraph?
Yeah, the point about India's interests here, the key part is what are India's interests, which India is trying to secure by working with these other powers. So India's interests essentially are, as you know, India is a very poor country. The per capita income of India is $2,000 US per person, compared to China's $10,000 or United States $60,000. India is a very, very poor country. India's unemployment is high, inflation is very high. India's priority right now is to somehow bring these people up, have better education, better standards of living. So the interest, especially when comes to working with countries in Europe, is to actually have better trade, be allowed to export more goods, somehow find ways in which you can get cheaper gas, cheaper stuff, you can get some concessions on tariffs, you can get some new technologies, etc., etc. These interests need not necessarily be security-centric interests. A lot of these interests are dealing with economy and a lot of other things which may happen. This may not be true when it comes to countries like Russia, when it comes to countries like the United States, when it comes to countries like France, and when it, of course, comes to China. Or when it comes to China aside as a special case, but when it comes to Russia, United States, France, a lot of India's ties are based around security, around military goods, around military hardware, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of interests that India is trying to secure. But at no point in time, India wants to give an impression that it wants to take on China. At least that is what Mr. Modi's government's actions show. Even though their rhetoric, their words from his foreign minister and from a lot of other people, and the impression from the US officials particularly, conveys totally differently. So, let me step back a bit. The point I'm trying to make is that a large number of US officials almost convey this, and this is what Code also conveys, that it exists because China exists. If India is a member, the rationale, the basis of Indo-US ties is China. There is no, the fact is, why does the United States need India? United States needs India to counter China. India does not go out and deny this premise. When US officials say this, neither Mr. Modi nor his foreign minister, no one ever goes out and says, no, this is wrong. We are not going to do this. So you are, in a sense, trying to throw a bait to the United States, keeping the bait hanging, saying, yeah, we are with you. We want to take on China. But but that is not what the actions show. And I think this is that, while Mr. Modi wants that very fine balance and maneuverability, this is something which is going to come into conflict sooner rather than later. It cannot work that way, because at some point in time, there will be certain demands from the United States or certain actions that you will be forced to take, which may provoke China. And if you do not take those steps, then the United States may say that, why are you not doing it? Because all along you've been stringing us along, saying that we are with you to take on China. If you are with us to take on China, then do these 1, 2, 3 things. Let's say the United States Navy or the Indo-PACOM comes and says, we should do a joint naval patrol in South China Sea. And it could become a really big thing. India would say, no, we don't want to go there because the Beijing would not like it, and they may target us in Ladakh. And the United States may say, why not? Because you are with us against China. Please do this. And that is where these kind of fault lines can really open up. So what currently looks like a great strategy, a great policy, may not be that great as it plays out over a period of time.
Now, Sushant, I want to end our conversation with something very simple. Let's use the word democracy. That we know that, again, you might disagree with me, but a lot of experts that on the show that we're trying to keep this peaceful conversation. But U.S. today, I guess it's disputable to say that America is a role model of democracy today, even given the fact that domestically and also internationally. But meanwhile, we know that under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that being this democratic system has always been the priority. But meanwhile, China today also has its own understanding of this internal democracy and also this democratic system towards the world. Now, my question, Sushant, to you is, from your perspective, how should we understand the word democracy today based on the capitalistic or the economic system in India today? So in other words, as an expert in Indian policy or as an expert as a political scientist scholar, how should we understand this democracy in India today?
Yeah, so Will, that's a great question. Indian democracy, by all standards, whether by Western standards or other standards, is in great decline. Is in great decline. It is not doing very well. But so is the U.S. democracy. American democracy is not doing well either. So the Indian democracy essentially was a project because India was a society which was a very unequal society, which was driven by caste, where oppression had been prevalent. It was a project to give every human being a certain amount of dignity, a certain amount of power, a certain amount of share in political power, and a voice, which allowed them to feel as a part of this great project called India, as an equal citizen. That was the ideal on the basis of which it started. Unlike, it was not a small elite which is only upper caste, upper class, wealthy elite, which is controlling the country and which has all the power. How do you, for a country which historically over centuries has seen caste oppression, has seen religious conflict, etc., how do you bring all those people up and make them feel valuable and part of a national project, part of a project where they feel that they have political power, they can decide who rules them? That was essentially the idea of Indian democracy. How far that has succeeded, what have been its pitfalls and shortcomings? Of course, there have been massive shortcomings, because income inequality has risen in India, economic growth has been poor. Although poverty has reduced, it has not reduced at a pace it could have reduced. Education standards are poor, public health standards are not as good. So of course, democracy has not delivered in that respect. And over the last few years, even this power to the people, their rights, the universal rights, human rights, freedom of press, etc., they have all suffered in India. So yes, I would agree with you if you were to say that Indian democracy is not even coming true on the promise that it held 75 years ago. And especially once you look at economic inequality, neoliberalism, and its pitfalls. Yes, there's a lot that India can do. But is there something that India can learn from China in that case? Yes, I've always believed that India should look at the Chinese public health, public education system, and the way China lifted a large number of people out of poverty and brought them up to a certain level of public health and public education, which allowed this massive economic growth to take place. In India, the cart has been put before the horse, where the economic growth has taken place while public health and public education continue to suffer. So yeah, in that sense, India has a long way to still to go. But Indian democracy has delivered in some respects. That casteism has come down. You don't have untouchability in India. You don't have those kind of things which were like prevalent, really inhuman things, almost at par with slavery. Slavery were prevalent. Those things at least have gone away because of the kind of democracy that India has pursued.
Well, I think, Sushant, needless to say that through this pandemic, which rocked the whole world since the year of 2020, that today, that when we look at the countries across the world, they're always something that we all should learn from each other. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to reintroduce our guest. It's Sushant Singh, and is a senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research in India. And Sushant, he was previously a lecturer in political science at Yale University and the deputy editor of the Indian Express, reporting on strategic affairs, national security, and international affairs. Sushant, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we'd love to have you back on the show again as we continue to monitor and follow the progress not only in India but also in China and across the globe. Thank you, sir.